So as I mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about some global research that we've been doing at the World Bank, looking at parliamentary oversight. My presentation is in 3 parts. The first part is going to be looking at some recent research, looking at Westminster systems of parliamentary oversight committees or public accounts committees and the Napoleonic system. Then I'm going to focus on some very particular research that came out about a year ago on parliamentary audit committees. And finally, talk a little bit about platforms moving forward for knowledge exchange and peer learning on these areas. So there's different frameworks in which you can look at comparing different models of parliamentary systems. And you'll see here the second one that's highlighted in red is the one we're going to focus on today. We talked a lot yesterday about the importance of committees, and there's a real connection between different parliamentary traditions and committee structures. Yesterday it was referenced that there's bifurcated systems in which there's a standalone audit committee and then a separate budget or estimates committee, and that there's a conflated system in which one committee does both of these types of functions. All of these different frameworks are interrelated, but we will focus on number 2. I'll skip this. So what do we know about other traditions? Let me just give you a brief background on where we are in the road that's led up to this point. We feel it's important to understand the institutional design and the dynamic of different systems. And there is strong evidence of cross-fertilization of evolving good practice for parliamentary oversight committees. In 1999, we supported a study group that looked at what some of the good practices are for public accounts committees, specifically from Westminster systems. As a result, someone named David McGee published a book called The Overseers, which has really been used over the last 10 years as a guide to what some of the good practices are. We then realized that things had changed, that this was actually quite a traditional view of what parliamentary oversight committees should be doing, and decided to undertake a survey process. This is a survey that we sent to approximately 100 countries that have dedicated audit committees. And we were able to take that data, do a comparative analysis, and recently, about a year ago, released a publication called Following the Money, which is a 10-year update on the overseers. Then we realized that we needed to actually build a strong understanding of other parliamentary communities and have started undertaking research on the global Napoleonic parliamentary systems in collaboration with McGill University and Laval University in Canada. We want to be able to look at some of those initial findings, which I'll share with you today, in order to identify how oversight works in Napoleonic systems compared with Westminster systems. As you can see, we have yet to be able to collect that data on the Lusophone systems. So that, again, is where Miriam and Thomas are going to come in during this week to be able to make sure we're able to capture a full global data set of parliamentary oversight committees and their functions. So talking about these initial findings that we found from comparing Napoleonic and Westminster systems, we're going to look at a particular example, which is the comparison of the inquiry process in both of those models. We surveyed about 50 countries. We sent a survey to about 50 countries through the APF and got about 30 responses and compared those to the responses we got from Westminster surveys. We compared specifically 9 aspects under the inquiry process that you'll see here: the initiation of the process, the mandate, activities, power to question, witnesses called, unanimity of decisions, inquiry reports, were they disseminated, public communications, Was there a communication strategy? And government responses. What was the follow-up to the inquiry? So I'm going to go through each of, I'm sorry. Okay, we're back. So I'm going to go through each of these 9 indicators to be able to highlight what some of the initial findings are. First is the initiation of the process of the inquiry, and we looked at the percentage of inquiries initiated by the committee or commission itself, by the Parliament, by the Supreme Audit Institution, and by a minister. Just briefly to note that there's quite a lot of commonality we found between the Westminster system countries. Unlike the Francophone Napoleonic system, even though we got approximately 30 responses, they came from different traditions. There's the Francophone Westminster system, which actually follows common law. There's the Francophone Napoleonic system, which follows the civil code from France, or was colonized by some other country other than France. And then there's also this category of other. So there's quite a lot of differences between the different responses as well, as a side note. So going back to this initiation of inquiries process, what's notable about this chart is that if you look at the commission, if it initiates the inquiry itself, you'll see in Napoleonic systems, the mean is 42, and in Westminster, it's 26. Also, if you look at the Supreme Audit Institution line, you'll see in Napoleonic, it's 12, and in Westminster, it's 51. So the first difference that we can see here is that commissions in Francophone systems actually have far more powers in terms of initiation of inquiries rather than those in Westminster systems, which hugely rely on the Supreme Audit Institution. Looking at mandate, who determines the mandate of the inquiry? If you look at the line regarding commission or committee, you'll see that both Napoleonic and Westminster, about half the time, 50 and 41, the committee determines what the mandate is. For most of the rest, what's interesting if you look at the Supreme Audit Institution is that with Napoleonic systems, it's far less important in determining the mandate of the commission versus Westminster, 8 versus 19. Otherwise, they're actually quite similar. Looking at activities, another indicator. How many reports did the committee write in the past year? There's actually a huge difference between Napoleonic and Westminster systems. The average was 2.7 reports per year in Napoleonic versus 12.2 in Westminster systems. This is actually linked to our recent research on public accounts committees that Mitch mentioned yesterday, and the correlation between the PAC reports, the number of reports that they issue, as well as the level of corruption. It's not actually the number of meetings that we originally thought, which was an indication of effective PAC practice, but actually the number of reports that are issued. So this is telling. Powers. Can the committee call witnesses to give testimony? More common in Westminster, but also very common in Napoleonic, and about the same when we ask about whether the committee requires submissions of documents, 88 to 100. Witnesses usually called. More frequently, they're actually called in Napoleonic systems from, you'll see the beginning, the ministers and officials from the Supreme Audit Institution. And then if you go down and you look at the next 3 lines, we've got department officials, public enterprises, and government agencies. Those are more frequently called in Westminster systems, as well as if you go down looking at local government officials and NGOs. So what does this show us? Well, you can surmise that in Napoleonic systems, they're more concerned with the political accountability by bringing in the ministers for witnessing, as witnesses, rather than the Westminster system, which may be more concerned with whether the money has been spent efficiently, therefore bringing in the department officials, public enterprises, and government agencies. The work of the committees. Must the decisions taken by the committee be unanimous? In Westminster systems, significantly more said yes, 26% versus 6% in Napoleonic systems. The committee must be unanimous in Westminster systems, however, to provide context, because there's greater probability that the government has to accept the recommendations. Because as you remember, in a lot of these countries, the Public Accounts Committee is chaired by the opposition. However, there still can be a minority report. So that's what the incentive is, to provide unanimity in committee decisions. Looking at committee reports, what I wanted to note here was the third line. Inquiry reports are sent to Parliament even if it isn't sitting. The only interesting difference is that in Napoleonic systems, it's 67%, and in Westminster systems, it's 36%. So double as much, twice as frequently in Napoleonic systems. Otherwise, mostly similar. Communications with the public. We talked a lot about this yesterday. The biggest difference here is the second line. If you look at the committee has a public communication strategy. In Napoleonic systems, only 6% do. In Westminster systems, only at 33% do. So in all instances in this table, the Westminster system is higher in terms of communication with the public. Again, wanted to remind you we don't have the data yet for Lusophone countries, so hopefully that will be able to provide us a broader picture. And lastly, looking at government responses to the inquiry. If you look at this, the government must formally respond to committee reports, and the government response must be deposited in Parliament. It's actually mostly similar between Westminster and Napoleonic. So looking at a synthesis of all of these different indicators with the inquiry process, our initial findings are showing us that the Napoleonic system seems to produce a weaker system of ex post oversight than the Westminster system. The main differences concern the powers of the committee as well as the public communication strategy of the committee. Otherwise, there isn't that much significant difference between the two. You'll see here, if you look at the mandate, the Napoleonic system is quite high compared to Westminster, and going down, it's the opposite, where the Westminster system is higher than the Francophone system. Ultimately, and what we want to be able to learn from all this is something we like to call two-way learning. So there's a potential for each of these different systems to learn from each other. The idea is that we don't blindly go and accept what the other system has, because if a system has a public accounts committee or a standalone audit committee, that doesn't need to be adopted in your system necessarily. We need to see where the systems are weak and to be able to target how we can improve those particular needs and aspects. And then this summer, the full research will be published. So we'll make sure to let everyone know when that is published so you can see what those findings are. This is just a little bit of the initial findings. The second part of my presentation is going to cover briefly the research that we've done on public accounts committees, again, the standalone audit committees. We did this research, as I mentioned, because we felt that over the last decade, there were studies that were trying to identify what made PACs work effectively. And so we asked the questions, how can we measure audit committee performance? How do we know if a PAC is effective? How can we develop standards when we don't actually know what works? So recent research teaches us a number of lessons. We're going to particularly look at the structure, activities, and capacity of public accounts committees. Again, this is something that I think would be interesting to you, even if you don't have the public accounts committees, to see what the different forms and functions of those are, and see what some of those strengths and weaknesses are as well. So what's the old story from 1999, as I mentioned? The old story was that the size of the PACs matter. The larger the PAC, the more effective the PAC. Mitch mentioned yesterday, actually what the new research is showing is that somewhere between 5 and 11 committee members can really mean that it's more effective. Also, the number of staff was important in the old story. The more staff you have to support your committee, administratively, technically, the more effective your committee is going to be. And that there was adequate representation of the opposition, and that the political affiliation of the committee should be, of the chair should be the opposition. What's the news story? So the size has changed in terms of what we anticipate would be an effective number of members of the committee. But what's mostly interesting is that the party affiliation of the chair may not be as critical as we thought it was. The comparison that we had was that most opposition chairs, about 66% before and now 70% now, the prevailing practice was not necessarily the best. Having a chair from the opposition doesn't necessarily ensure, we found, different outcomes and effectiveness. Some may say that someone that's more independent and senior as a chair of the government may increase the likelihood of recommendations being implemented. Skip that. Then we look at the activities. What's the old story? What did we used to think? We used to think that organizational features and characteristics mattered, and committee practices mattered. The indicators of success were frequency with which certain results were achieved. As I mentioned, number of meetings held, number of subjects covered, number of reports produced. And the new story is that the thinking has evolved, that the number of meetings is less important, and what's more important are the number of reports and the number of inquiries that a committee initiates and conducts, sorry. And here's a couple of graphs to show what we mean. We're showing here that the control of corruption has a strong and positive relationship with the number of PAC reports. You can see that there are some outliers here, but in general, the line goes diagonally with some of the different countries that we have data from. Similarly, if you look at the next slide, the control of corruption also has a strong and positive relationship with economic development. Also, diagonal line with a few outliers. The bottom line is that PAC effectiveness is a cause and not a consequence of good governance. PACs make a positive contribution to curbing corruption and enhancing development. Oversight committees. What makes some oversight committees work in some regions has no impact, though, on what happens in other regions. One size does not fit all. And to increase the effectiveness of audit committees, it is important to address and understand country-specific needs. Again, something we mentioned yesterday. And finally, looking at the capacity of PACs, I just wanted to highlight one part of this, which was that it's important. The old story was that the number of staff that we had, the better, the more effective the PAC was. The new story is that it's not the number of staff you have helping your committee, but it's the quality of staff and the professionalism of the staff. I just wanted to show this two-way learning example. Here's a list of some of the emerging and new public accounts committees, standalone audit committees in non-Commonwealth countries. Most recently, we have Tunisia, we have Morocco, I think those are the two most recent. Sorry? And Bhutan. Again, not Commonwealth countries. That takes me to my last slide. There's a lot going on in terms of audit committees around the globe. We really believe that working in Parliament, being a member of Parliament is a practice, and that's why we want to bring everyone together to share their practices. We work with a number of communities of practice around the globe, or networks, in which they provide a forum for audit committees, parliamentary audit committees, to share information, come up with resolutions, prepare action plans to implement nationally, and to come back and then be able to share what those the successes and challenges that they faced trying to implement those national level reforms. So you can see from this map, we work with a network of public accounts committees in West Africa, one made up of the PACs in states in Nigeria. We work with SADCOPAC, which works with the Southern African Development Community, and we have Mozambique and Angola here, which are members of SADCOPAC. We also have ARAPAC, the yellow region on the right, which looks at Asian countries and their audit committees. And then we're looking at being able to help establish one for the community of Portuguese language, community of Portuguese-speaking countries. And that's something that we're very eager to work on with you and with our partners. What I'm showing you is a screenshot from a website. We have a platform, and some of our friends from Mozambique and Angola can share with you what some of the benefits are of being able to use an online portal to share information. We have developed a global wiki village, if you will, which is a page that can connect to all the different regional audit committee networks. So you can learn about each of the countries in each of these networks that will be able to share what their rules of procedure are, what some of their examples of their reports are from their committees, what some of the challenges are, that sort of a thing. And so we're very excited to be able to share with you that website once it becomes live. We really do believe that there is this two-way, or if you see here, five-way learning process between the different networks. And I think that's probably a good segue into my friend Lata's presentation, where she's going to talk about a portal for parliamentary development that she helps run.